Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here at the NAI. I'm Lee Freund, for those who don't know me, the president and CEO of the NAI. We've had a very eventful 2020. Here are just a few highlights from our perspective. We're assisting members to comply with our updated 2020 Code of Conduct. Most of you are involved in that compliance process, as well as the CCPA and other requirements. We've welcomed multiple new members. We've released best practices on non-advertising uses of data, and we've issued guidance on health targeting, working with our partners on health advertising and imprecise location data. So again, we're sad that we couldn't be with you to celebrate our 20th anniversary. We tried in the spring, we tried in the fall. It's just not working because of the pandemic, but we are thrilled to welcome you to the very first event that we're hosting this fall. The responsible companies that belong to the NAI support a free and open internet, and we make strong self-regulatory commitments to enhance consumer privacy. That means that we have a lot of values in common with privacy advocates, even when we don't agree on every detail. So today, to kick off the fall, we're holding hopefully a thoughtful and thought-provoking debate about the intersection of innovation and privacy. Our experts from industry, advocacy, and academia are going to discuss contentious privacy topics such as health data, location data, sharing data with law enforcement, non-cookie tech, consent mechanisms, and we'll see if we can find common ground. And although the topics might be contentious, I'm sure our debate will be very friendly. As we tell our kids, it's really important to engage and listen to people we don't necessarily agree with. So that's what we hope to do today. So before I get started, I'll also mention that we hope you'll join us next month, October 22nd, for an NAI panel discussion on location data. This discussion will explore opportunities and privacy challenges of using consumer location data for non-marketing purposes, including whether the time has come for a national law to regulate its use or whether certain practices should just be banned outright. Our moderator is going to be Byron Tao, who's a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who has covered this topic extensively. So it should be a very interesting and exciting panel. But today is about our privacy debate. So let me welcome our panelists. Joining us today, we have Woody Hartzog, who is a professor at the Northeastern University School of Law. We have Ken Dreifach, who's a shareholder with Zwilgen Attorneys. Thanks, Ken, for the NAI background. Justin Brookman, who is a director of consumer privacy and technology policy with Consumer Reports. Alan Chappell, who's the president of Chappell and Associates and a member of our NAI board representing IOTA. And Pam Dixon, who's the founder and executive director of the World Privacy Forum. So welcome to all my panelists. I am technically the moderator for this panel, although I kind of feel like with the experts that we have in the room, you can kind of moderate yourselves. But let's start with the state of play. The ad industry is really facing unprecedented pressures and challenges with regulatory and legislative efforts globally to restrict the use of data and platforms limiting access to data that is traditionally used by the industry. So let's just start with the state of play. Can each of you comment on the challenges the industry is facing from your own perspective and your thoughts on if the industry even has a future? Well, we can start, whoever wants to start. Let's start with Pam, since she's right to my right on my screen.
Pam, you're muted.
Oh, did you say Ken or Pam?
Hi, I'm gonna have to actually log off and log back on because my Zoom window just evaporated. I have no controls. So I'll be right back and I'll rejoin you in a moment. I'm so sorry.
Well, I'll say a word or two since I initially misheard you. So that's so I think one of the big challenges that is facing the industry, which is perhaps an obvious one that's getting a lot of publicity, is the consolidation of data and the potential increased consolidation of data in a small number of very large platforms that have layered and tiered services, and in ways that if you look at the GDPR, there's been more consolidation of data in the advertising world, and with the deprecation of third-party cookies that will that's certainly threatened to continue. So I think that's something that in crafting legislation really has to be at the forefront. Do we want data to be more consolidated, or do we feel better about the market effects of having data more diffused?
Okay, I'm back. Thank you. A little Zoom glitch there. So I think I'll just start with some super duper brief comments. And you know, in general, I do think that the global trend lines are toward data that are no longer centralized. I think that you see this across a variety of disciplines, everything from biometrics to identity systems to advertising systems. So I think it's incredibly important to consider that decentralized structures have a lot of privacy by design thought built into them, and they're important to consider. Centralized structures, generally speaking, particularly in the ad ecosystem, do introduce higher levels of risk. I think that in terms of the NAI and the advertising industry, I think a good step forward was the very early guidance on COVID-19 targeting. I thought that was very well accomplished. I am quite concerned, however, about the use of marketing data for non-marketing purposes. In the past, this has always been an extremely bright line, and every time I've testified before Congress on this issue, someone from the advertising industry has told Congress that they promise up and down, backwards and sideways in every direction, that no, they will never use marketing data for non-marketing purposes. So I think that as a strategic issue for the advertising industry, it's very difficult. And I think that it could have very significant complications down the road, and including policy complications. And I just think as well that that was a decision that needed to have much more public input before it was taken. So that's my 2 cents on that. Thank you so much.
I'll jump in and say that from my perspective, like I see this really as an overdue reckoning around this stuff. I mean, we've been, I think of like cross context tracking as like the original and accidental sin of the internet, and we've been trying to fix it ever since. I mean, like you're going back to like the 90s, right? Epic sued DoubleClick in court, trying to stop like the same behaviors we're talking about today. There's been like efforts here and there, self-regulatory, regulatory, to try to deal with it. And I feel like we're finally hitting some critical mass. We're seeing more regulation all around. We're seeing intermediaries take more steps to do it. And I think it's been a long time coming. Whether there's a future for the industry, I think there is. I like advertising, but I think the future looks a lot different than it does now. Quickly, to Ken's point, I think focusing on the consolidation is not for me like the core point. I think the consolidation is a real issue and it is a problem, but it's orthogonal to the core privacy issue, which is like too much data, right? I mean, everyone has too much data. If we cut off the third party like streams, that hits Google and Facebook worse than anyone else. And so from my point of view, I think that's somewhat of a distraction, and the core is like, we just need to cut off a lot of the data flows.
Okay, Alan, you have the last word.
Well, I mean, I would agree with Justin that I think there needs to be a much larger focus on data minimization and privacy by design. I would disagree. I think that we need to figure out a way to regulate the broader data and advertising space in a way that doesn't just create more consolidation, because that's clearly what happened under the GDPR. That, you know, as I look out into the next, 3 to 5 years, unless something pretty drastic happens, we're going to be looking at a world, where there are, 8 to 10 very large platforms who have all of the data. And I'm not even talking advertising data. I think you're morphing into health and in other areas. But you're going to see a world where you have 8 to 10 very large platforms who have all the data with very little transparency regarding exactly what happens. Yeah, you'll have a bazillion terms that you can agree to or not, but there's going to be very little transparency regarding how the data is used. There's almost no data minimization standard. And then just wearing my advertising hat for a minute, that one of the key issues with some of those platforms is that there's very little ability to vet or verify the efficacy of the media spend. And so this is a bad outcome, not just for consumers and data privacy, but also for the very advertisers who are really trying to reach, that right customer at the right time and to vet measure their spend.
So let's stick with that for a second, because I heard a couple of different things. We talked about consolidation of data among big platforms, and I know this is a privacy discussion and not a market power discussion or a competition discussion. But Pam also mentioned the concept of decentralized data, and that is something that our industry, as the group of third-party ad tech, has always advocated for: fragmentation of that data and not holding it among small or bigger players. Is more privacy protective, because not everybody has the full insight into who you are as a digital person. But what about the privacy implications of this consolidation? What do you think? Alan mentioned a lack of transparency. What do we think is going to happen to our privacy norms? Do we trust Apple to do the right thing with our data? Do we trust Google? Do we trust them more than we trust the rest of the industry?
So just to tackle this a little bit, I think it's really important not to think, so because you're in the industry, you're thinking of this as, us versus them, platform thing. When I'm talking about centralization, that's not what I'm thinking about. I'm really thinking about the data architecture of centralizing data. This can happen at any level. For example, there are 15-person data broker shops that have profound stores of centralized data. Mm-hmm. And, I think it's really important that we are cautious about size. Even if you look at how, for example, whole countries build identity data structures. There are countries that have built centralized databases. We know, for example, India has done this with the Aadhaar system. And because of a Supreme Court decision, they were forced to decentralize it. We know that smaller countries have, gone each way. So centralization versus decentralization is a decision that individual companies, despite their size, can make. And I just think that it's a very good best practice to consider for data handling whenever possible. I hope that's helpful, because I think it's very important to broaden the conversation around the advertising ecosystem. And right now there's these really well-built, well-honed and refined trenches with, turrets that are all shiny. And I think we've got to take all of that down and try to have a different conversation where we don't have a us versus them approach just built in.
Yeah, I agree. We talked a little bit about data minimization, which has long been held by both advocates in the industry as an important safeguard of consumer privacy. What about the concept of, because of these platform changes, we might be moving to a world where authenticated user data logged in with email or a telephone number or even other identifiable information is much more prevalent? How do you feel about companies having access to more personal data as a result of that?
I'll just jump in. So look, I have long said that one of the great flaws with both the GDPR and the CCPA, the European data regulation and the California privacy regulation, is that they actually encourage the building of silos full of very rich stores of personal data. And typically it has to be identifiable so that businesses can effectuate all of those rights that are supposed to be given to consumers. And I think it's a really poor structure. And already you see really thoughtful people in Europe rethinking some of these things. So I don't know where this is going to end up, but I do think that it does introduce a lot of risk.
I mean, the other side to this is that in a world where email becomes much more important and where cookies are deprecated, this system, for better or worse, that we have now looks a little different, and probably first parties and brands who right now are undergoing some stress and suffering will potentially, if they can get it right, have more information. Publishers may have more information, and the intermediaries may still be very important, but instead of it being kind of a big sloppy Joe of a sandwich, it becomes kind of like a roast beef sandwich where the buns are thicker and there's a little bit less in the middle. But invariably, there's going to be a need to intermediate data and to intermediate marketing and content, because that's the way that marketing and advertising has been delivered for the last couple of centuries. And I think that functionality is unlikely to change.
Well, let me poke at that a little bit, Ken. I mean, what the Chrome team seems to be attempting to create would, I think, make that whole notion obsolete. I mean, if you know, the whole concept of having flocks, and by the way, it's not 100% clear that that's a workable solution. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that they are able to push that through. I mean, that's sort of, then really the net is that the advertisers, they may have some data, but they aren't going to get access to the actual data that they need to measure their ad campaigns.
Well, right, yeah. I mean, what I'm suggesting is it's conceptual, but the idea is that hashed emails, theoretically, combined with perhaps IP addresses, could replace or could serve the same purpose as the third-party cookie. So it's, you know, a lot of stuff has to happen for that to become the new standard. But I think there's a lot of thought going into that right now.
No, I agree, but implicit in that is that we as an industry are comfortable continuing the arms race. And I'm not here to say yet we should or we shouldn't. But let's at least acknowledge that's what that is.
So,
I think this is the fight that's been happening. People are pushing back on these systems, and we're putting legal protections in place, and the platforms are adjusting. And the answer is not just to recreate ad tech all around the back end. I mean, when it's the question of authentication, like authentication's fine. If I'm logged into Google, to access my Gmail, that's totally reasonable. But like, does that mean I want all the third-party data, tracked? Like when I'm on New York Times or on ESPN, do I want Google or Facebook or any thousands of other companies who don't have who have harder to get access to authentication data, but are finding ways to do it via hashed emails or other ways? I think the answer is that all should just stop. I mean, we shouldn't trying to find ways to violate context and to maintain third-party tracking and data usage at all costs, and that's the fundamental problem. The actual tactics, I think, don't actually matter that much.
So let me stick with that a little bit, and I want to hear from Woody on this too, because this kind of raises the question of the realities of data in the world today and the realities of this industry, and that data isn't going away, and somebody's going to figure out how to use the data anyway. So how do we do it in a trustworthy way? And what are how do we deal with the realities of operationalizing privacy compliance? So Woody, I don't know if you want to take a first shot at that, and I'm sure that others are eager to jump in.
Yeah, I would, but though, if you'll permit me to sort of take a step back before I jump into that, and second what Pam said, which is that we've got these sort of set debates, and we spend a lot of time sort of fighting within the anonymization identification debate, right, or the cross-site tracking debate, and there are all these centralization versus decentralized. But one of the things that I think is really the big challenge is, you asked the question at the very beginning, what's one of the major challenges? It seems to me that a lot of these debates are occurring and missing the massive reckoning, I think that the word that Justin used, and maybe a dawning awareness within industry, within government, within society generally, that data fuels advertising, creates a structure. It is a deeply moral act that creates a structure that affects people's lives, not just because of the effect that the advertising has on them, right? With micro-targeting, with things that we see, things that we can click, but also because of the ways in which these structures then feed decision-making systems that create externalities like sapped attention spans, and potential corrosion of public institutions, and environmental impact, all of which is in my mind, very difficult to disentangle from the structures laid by the personal data industrial complex. I think that there's a lot.
All of that on advertising, right? It's not all.
No, absolutely not. It's not. It's everything, right? It's the entire data ecosystem. But targeted advertising, micro-targeted advertising, is fueling a lot of this incentives, a lot of the structures that are getting laid, a lot of the norms that are getting set. And so I think sort of thinking about a lot of these, what I would consider to be narrow debates, are important, but sometimes they can tend to miss the big picture. But now let me answer your question that you asked me, which is how do we operationalize potential privacy protective frameworks? And I think that a lot of what I've been thinking about lately is this concept of trust, obligations of care, obligations of loyalty, obligations of confidentiality. And the way that I've been thinking about that recently is to look to existing frameworks that also take advantage of those structures, which is fiduciary law. And the concept of information fiduciaries that has been developed by Jack Balkin and Neil Richardson and I have been writing about the role of trust and privacy law for a while. And these rules are there. And they are a way that if they're applied and if people knew that organizations were bound by rules of trust, then that would dramatically change, I think, a lot of other regulatory approaches. It would put less weight on consent as a mechanism for justifying lots of data practices. It would mean that people were protected no matter what they did, which actually would, I think, enable a lot more trust and probably solve a lot of problems that we have about the collection of data and how that data is used, because we could rely upon the fact that people would not be using data against data subjects' best interests.
Could I pop in there real quickly?
Yeah, and then Ken.
Okay, so I just want to follow on what Woody was just saying, and I would just again bring up the issue of the use of marketing data for non-marketing purposes. So we wrote a report called The Scoring of America. It was a benchmarking report on AI and machine learning and on the way that data was being used in consumers' lives. And we focused on the most meaningful uses. And we found, just to give one of literally thousands of examples, we found, for example, purchase history and other advertising data being used to create neighborhood risk scores. Those neighborhood risk scores were then sorted down to the household level and became part of an algorithmic equation, et cetera, for household level credit scores. Now, they're not the regulated credit scores under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but their predictive value is commensurate. So I think it's very important to understand that the focus for regaining trust in the advertising ecosystem also really has to focus on what the data is being used for. If marketing data that is collected for marketing purposes is used for marketing purposes, that's a huge step forward. But now the industry has officially crossed the line in July 2020 with the guidance. And I just think that it's a really big, stark watershed moment. And I don't think it was a good step to take. And I think it does need to be addressed with broader stakeholders. I promise you that if privacy experts and scholars had been involved with that guidance, it would not be a mere suggestion that data be aggregate. There would be all sorts of suggestions, and there would have been so much encouragement to not do that. I just can't imagine that all of the marketing data will then be used for even eligibility decisions and other things like that. It's just really, that's really opening a Pandora's world. It's not a box, it's a whole world of Pandora mischief.
So I just want to go back. I want to address the first part of Woody's point and about data in advertising being potentially manipulative, more manipulative with data. And I guess Justin's point as well about the original sin. I think it's really hard to have these discussions without a little bit of historical and functional context about why, you know, cross-site and database, data-driven marketing started to happen. Okay, it didn't happen just because some innovative people wanted to make a data grab and learn a lot of stuff about people and see what happened. It happened because there was a marketing need for it. And to understand that, I mean, you know, for 250 years, right, it's been customary to put advertising and marketing in content, in newspapers, on radio, TV, and so on. That's how advertising and marketing gets done. Historically, you didn't need that much data to do that because there wasn't much product differentiation and there was very little content differentiation, right? In the golden age of advertising, which was probably more manipulative, perhaps arguably than the advertising we have today, you could get 30% of the US population in front of the TV watching the same show. That doesn't happen today. And the product choices, right, you just are astoundingly greater. And people are different. And marketers treat people and can't treat people as monolithic. So like Alan and I are attorneys, right? And I mean, most of us on the panel are attorneys. 50 years ago, you would have known how to market to a couple of middle-aged attorneys, right? You're going to sell them gray suits and slacks and wingtips and probably golf clubs. Okay, I don't know what Alan is wearing right now, but he's probably not wearing wingtips. And it's hard to figure out what people like us want to buy, right? I'm a green consumer. I have an electric car. I eat green hamburgers, right? Plant-based stuff. If Impossible Foods or Beyond Burger wants to find me to market their new, you know, meatballs to me, they can't, right? That didn't happen 50 years ago. We didn't have that product differentiation, right? So we need to do it with data, or something has to change, or marketing has to not be as good. And that hurts small businesses more than it hurts big businesses, and it hurts innovators more than it hurts non-innovators. You disagree, Justin? So I
strongly disagree. This is ridiculous. I'm sorry. It can't be the case. So marketing's harder now, and therefore my clients are entitled to collect every data point about you, whether online or offline or location, with the idea that maybe some value might flow, like incremental value might end up flowing down to a publisher or some small business. I mean, what's the limiting principle there? Like, why not eavesdrop on phone conversations? Why don't you cookie phone calls, right? Because there might be some valuable data in there because marketing is too hard right now. I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. That's like infuriating to hear that rationalization. I don't think any consumer thinks that way either. Justifies that, well, yeah, it's harder for them to find me, therefore I'm fine with every, like 90 NAI members tracking everything I do because it might help them find me. Like no one thinks that way.
But it's literally true. 30 years ago when you had the Got Milk campaign, everybody drank milk. Today you can't market milk because there's milk and there's oat milk and there's rice milk and there's pea milk and there's soy milk and there's lactose, milk, and there's 1% and 2% and chocolate and strawberry and every type of, there's enormous product differentiation. So it's not easy to find your audience. That's why all of this exists.
So look, we're all in our trenches again. So I have a radical proposition for this industry and for privacy advocates. And that is this. I think we need to get out of our foxholes. And I think we need to find a way to learn how to talk to each other without referring to tropes and to things that are well worn. Here's what I think is really important. Look, there is health data being utilized and sold, which will have an impact on consumers' lives. And it could have a very significant marketplace impact on consumers' lives that is deleterious. We need to figure out what that looks like when it happens and provide systemic data and proof and understanding when and where this happens instead of just conjecture. We need to put data points to this. And if we put all of our heat and light into providing really meaningful research about, okay, where are the risks? Let's substantiate these. And there's got to be a movement where all of us find a center ground where we can solve the problems. And there has to be a willingness to solve some of the problems that are harmful to consumers. And for me, that's where my attention is. What's causing harm? I really don't want to see medical related data sold outside of the marketing ecosystem. That really bothers me, and I think it's very harmful. Just to give you an example, we see people being COVID shamed, people who've literally, there was a gentleman who committed suicide over it. It's horrifying. How can we prevent that kind of data from creating harms to neighborhoods, to communities, to real people? And we've got to figure that out. And it's a very, very complex ecosystem, so we can't have one-sided conversations. We need to listen to everybody. So I challenge everyone on this call to figure out how we can get this done in a meaningful way to solve real problems and really make a serious attempt to have communications that don't fall into these old patterns, because we won't be able to solve these problems when we're manning our machine guns.
So one thing I'd like to say about that, Pam, is, and Justin, I'll let you talk. You're shaking your head. So, is one thing that we've always considered and might implement is a type of advisory council to advise the NAI in creating guardrails and guidelines that include the advocacy community, and that, you know, so that we can gain valuable insights. Because I think you're right that everybody's in their foxhole. My question is, and maybe Justin, since you were going to speak next, maybe this is for you, since I already know how you're going to answer. Can this industry regain trust? It's all about trust. Nobody trusts us. Nobody trusts that we anonymized or de-identified data. Nobody trusts that anybody is doing the right thing with respect to location data or sensitive health, which is something that the NAI is working very hard to provide clarity around. And if we have time, I'd love to get back to that. But if we do everything right, would you believe us? Like, is there a way to get there?
Let me just briefly explain why I was shaking my head at Pam. As I don't want to just focus on like the narrow, like the most harmful uses, right? I mean, those are important and those are making them the worst. But I mean, from my perspective, like this is all different shades of bad, and it all fundamentally needs to be addressed. My concern is not just the use of third-party marketing databases for credit scoring or health. I don't think that the third-party marketing databases should exist. Secondly, just quickly on the duty of care point, it does kind of flow into your question. I'm not quite convinced this is the right model, right? I mean, like Facebook is not a fiduciary in the sense that a bank is. I mean, or like if I go to Costco, right? Costco is not really a fiduciary, so I find that model not intuitive. I've not read Woody's latest 90-page article on this. I did read Lena Khan's 40-page article on this, and I think I tend to agree with her on this, that it's not quite the right fit. But it also kind of like, I think just kind of punts the same issue. It's like, what does duty of care mean? Senator Schatz has a bill defining duty of care, and it's virtually nothing. If you think their duty of care means don't share, then yeah, maybe. I just think it's just kind of punting the substantive discussion about what is good or what is bad. And again, like the trust issue, like ethics, you know, what I feel like there's a lot of like ethical and privacy greenwashing in the world. Like, you know, like whenever someone talks about privacy is core to our business. And I've heard the most dubious of data brokers talk about, you know, ethical data sourcing. And as long as you have a requirement that someone's privacy policy mentions something, therefore it's ethical. I think, and again, I've maybe it's because I've had this discussion for 20 years around do not track, watching how companies are complying with CCPA in ways that I think are not in good faith, that don't at all reform the behaviors the law is intended to do. And like, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, I won't be fooled again, right? Is the George Bush quote. Fundamentally, I think the law needs to be reformed, and I think it's on the way to being there. And I think watching, again, with GDPR too, like the way that it's been complied with, I think is not in good faith. And I think it's hard to say, trust us, if it is, again, just like, I think, reshuffling the deck chairs and dealing with the only most egregious edge cases.
Just a question. So Justin, when you say third-party databases or marketing databases should not exist, is that like any data or online, offline, regardless of consent or unconditionally, or?
I mean, the consent's like the hard piece, right? If someone really wants to allow for that, then like that's like, I don't want to crush someone's volition. The problem with consent is, we've seen how companies have complied with GDPR by putting up these cookie consent screens, which are obviously not remotely consent. And so I think if you want to allow for consent and let people do what they want, which is fine, then I think then you need to regulate design, and regulators need to be a lot more prescriptive. I know Woody is shaking his head, who's written I have read his book on this subject. If we're going to allow for it, and obviously we have to at some constitutional and fundamental free will level, we need to set the parameters by which that information is conveyed in a standardized way to people.
Yeah, I mean, if I can build on all of this that's been said, I do think that there actually is a way to regain trust, because I've been writing about trust and privacy. I do think there is actually a way to collect data and use it in a sustainable long-term way. But what it's going to take is moving away from this larger conceptualization of privacy as control over personal information and choice and consent and transparency. Because if you log on to any website, it's not just in AI, if you log on to, if you hear the CEOs of Google or Microsoft or anyone, and you ask them, how will you protect people's personal information? Then what you hear immediately in response is, we give you control, we give you choices, we ask your consent. And the reason that no one trusts anything, because that has come to ring completely false, right? Because the choices are all dictated for you. It's not like we get a text box where I get to email Google and say, Google, please don't do the following 1, 2, 3 things with my data. That would be control over information. Although even that's not optionable at scale. And so what we need is a move away from the entire regulatory approach that has underlined the entire fair information practices, right, which I realize is fundamental and is entrenched in the GDPR and the CCPA and every other regulatory framework, but it's the reason that all of this mistrust has been sowed. Now, there are 2 ways that you could get away from it, one of which I think is the fiduciary model, and Justin makes the point that Google is not like your doctor, which is true, but of course fiduciary is a much broader category than just doctors. And also a fiduciary is someone whoever the law says is a fiduciary. And so if the law dictates, right, because of immense power disparities and information disparities, that someone should be a fiduciary, then voila, right, it happens statutorily. And so I actually do talk about advertising in the most recent article I write about with the duty of loyalty, that I do think has more substance than the Schatz bill and the Cantwell bill. And I think there's a way to do it in a way that provides long-term sustainability, that lets people advertise. But if you're uncomfortable with the relational model, in other words, imposing obligations within the context of a relationship like a duty of loyalty or a duty of care, then you could move towards substantive rules that are not built around consent, substantive rules around design, substantive rules around the size of, and existence of biometric databases, for example. But that's going to have a lot of really difficult conversations about when we've gone too far, because the benefit of the consent and choice model is, as long as it's procedural, as long as you get people's consent, you do whatever you want. And we have to, I think, break beyond that sort of regulatory framework in order to regain people's trust, where people get protected no matter what they choose or what they consent to.
And to follow on, I do think there's another pathway. If you really look at Bo Rothstein's work on when trust is broken within society, when you have all parties who are acting against each other's wishes to their own detriment, one of the best ways, or I shouldn't say best way, but a very effective way of removing that social trap is by creating an Eleanor Ostrom-like model where you have people that are working together in a due process and fair negotiation. Now, Eleanor Ostrom spent 40 years figuring out how this worked, and it looks a lot like something that's already in law in the US and in other parts of the world, which is something called voluntary consensus standards. It's not self-regulation. It wouldn't be an advisory board. It would be an actual seat at the table where every stakeholder, large and small, all the consumers, people who have meaningful interests, would have a seat at that round table and could provide input. And there are a lot of rules already in place for these kinds of structures. The ANSI Essential Guidelines, the World Trade Organization rules on creating standards that are non-dominant, et cetera. There's also codes of conduct under the auspices of the GDPR. So there's a lot of ways that this can be done. And I do think that you know, a checkbox at the end of a process is some form of control, but it's a seat at the table is very meaningful. And I do think when people have a stake in something, that's when trust is acquired. And also when the conversation starts taking place and the parties begin to know each other as people, and when we can start to hear what the other stakeholders have to say and allow them to have their own positions, that's when we can regain trust. But it's a building process. It's not, you know, a product, it's a process.
So I agree with a lot of what Pam just said. I just have a question for the group. We spent 15 minutes talking about how we lost trust. What was the date that we had trust? And when we're thinking about that, maybe we can talk about who's we. I mean, is we the advertising industry, or is it just limited to, you know, the advertising technology industry over the last 15 to 20 years? But did we ever have, I mean, I've been involved in this for a long time. I mean, I don't know, did we ever have trust? And then I just have one other just blanket comment. I think on some level we have to acknowledge that there is too many decisions being made. Some of it's data related and some of it's life related, for any single person to be able to meaningfully comprehend. I mean, so that throws out the consent model. Consent is almost entirely unworkable. The only entities that can get a consent are the entities that are large enough who also have thousands, if not millions, of different consent decisions. I mean, the scope of this consent obtained is so far out of line with the actual practices that it's meaningless. So, but I'm not sure. I think Woody, you've got a framework there. I think there are certain steps that responsible businesses can and should be taking. You know, data minimization, just a thought process on do we need this data? How long should we be retaining it? You know, is there a way to, you know, back like 6-7 years ago, there was a handful of companies who were all about data science. There was really, and it was wonderful from the perspective of publishers because they were not using publisher identifying information in an advertising context. It was really more like there's this algorithm that says, if you visited 11 of these sites or taken, you know, then you're more likely to be interested in Nikes or something like that. And on the one hand, that sounds really, really intriguing. On the other hand, as those algorithms become more complex, then we have an algorithmic transparency question. So going back to my first question, I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts. When, you know, did we ever have trust?
Oh, this is a great question. It's one that I thought about. I think the answer is people have trusted and continue to trust every single entity that they interact with online, with the things that they see, with the data, the ways in which they expose themselves and the choices that they're able to make. And then with the well-being about the decisions that can be made on them sort of in the back end. So we trust all the time. I'm trusting how many companies, you know, certainly Zoom through this webinar, but we do so by our actions, right, with our exposure. And and so, but then of course it goes down the line. Sometimes we don't directly interact with lots of other companies, and then it can be a lot harder to say at that point, do you trust the party sort of much further down the chain that you don't have an interaction with? And that's where it gets difficult.
I want to poke at that a little bit, Woody, because
Can I poke in?
I would suggest that it's less about whether or not one trusts Zoom and more about that there's only a handful of alternatives. And here the NAI chose Zoom. And so therefore, my options are I participate in this webinar or I don't. And then my second.
But we define trust as a willingness to make yourself vulnerable to the actions of others, which is the way that I define trust. We have willingly made ourselves vulnerable, right? To a lot of people, right, in this conversation, but we do that. And that's the basis for the imposition of relational obligations of care, loyalty, and confidentiality.
Right, but that means you have a choice.
I do think that the control model is a really incredibly, very, very difficult way to move forward in this world, given the complexity of the data ecosystems. And given AI and machine learning, I'm just not sure how anyone could really effectuate full control. I think there's going to be some very good dashboard work that can be done by companies. And I think we should encourage that dashboard work. I think it's very helpful. And I think it does help. But in terms of controlling huge, long data flows over the course of our lives, that's much more difficult. In terms of your question about trust, Alan, I think, you know, I was on the internet before it was the internet. I remember sitting at Johns Hopkins and I saw a rollout of all the gophers in the world. I'll never forget the feeling I had. I had bumps everywhere and I'm like, oh, this is the future. And I was like, I have to write a book about it. You know, and I still have that book. It was called Be Your Own Headhunter Online. And it was loaded. It was 500 pages because I had to list all the little itty bitty internet service providers at the end. And, you know, I think we had trust at that time. I really do. It was a different world, but you know, I think that it's not a foregone conclusion that trust is gone forever. It can be rebuilt. If you look at the history of nations, you see, you know, all sorts of cyclical things. So I think that doing the things that allow trust to foster, I think I do like the fiduciary concept. There have been some extraordinary laws coming out of the developing world. Togo in Africa just passed a law that far exceeds the stipulations within the GDPR and then drops some of its onerous provisions, but it really focuses on the fiduciary duty. India's data privacy bill, should it ever pass, also has very interesting language about fiduciary duty. And in this way, some of the countries with slightly different legal systems than ours are actually advancing further than us. So I think it's important to look at the models and you know, data mine the models for those kinds of structures that might be assistive.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that the audience has time to ask a couple of questions. So to the extent that you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A in the tool. We already have 2. So I'm just going to read the question and let you all respond since we have less than 10 minutes left. I was going to ask a question about content moderation in 2:30, but I feel like that's a whole other hour. So, so here's a question. What is the impact of severe restrictions like those called for by Justin on new companies? It seems like one of the benefits of the type of micro-targeting that exists is that it enables new competitors in a niche space to reach their market in a cost-effective way, which was Ken's almond soy milk example. Additionally, if regulators specifically dictate privacy design, to what extent does that kneecap disruptors to Google and Facebook and the other big platforms? This isn't to say that privacy doesn't need to be reined in by regulation, but it tends to be a truth that stringent regulations also tend to help the entities that are currently in stronger positions since they already have brand familiarity and can afford compliance. Anyone have a response to that or a thought?
The question's, I think, directed somewhat at me, so and I'll own that I think it will actually make it harder for developers of niche products to find their market. I think that's true. That's like also the point, right? Me as an individual, maybe I don't want to be manipulated. Maybe again, I haven't heard that people's don't feel that they're delighted by ads, right? I think I've been delighted by an ad maybe twice in my life, right? Whereas, so the balance there about finding new products I might not otherwise know, I think is dramatically outweighed by the fact that, again, there's 90 companies even the deeper ecosystem, like having visibility into all the aspects of my lives, I find more repugnant, and I think can justify making it harder to reach those markets. As far as being prescriptive on design, my goal is, I think it would hopefully make it actually be tougher on Google and Facebook, because again, I think like Alan said, like they're the ones who are getting consent today. If you're looking like, at the flows they force users through in response to GDPR, like I think those are not good faith consent flows. I think that they are not getting real permission. Again, I think the goal should be actually like, it should be like the presumption should be that people do not want to consent to this, and it should be prohibited. Obviously, to the extent that we cannot stop free will, there needs to be clear rules around to do that. I think they would fall most strongly on Google or Facebook, unless it is like a company that does want to use the GDPR type consent mechanism, which obviously, as we know, is not really consent.
That's, I mean, just to be clear, so I hear what you're saying, Justin, and there's certainly some logic to it. I mean, Google and Facebook's share of the market in Europe has increased substantially since GDPR. Maybe it's 10, 12%, depending on what figures you take, because I mean it's kind of straightforward, right? If it's harder to share data, then entities that don't have to share data are in a better position. And your initial point, Justin, is also right, which is that Google and Facebook may in fact be harmed by reduced ability or more restrictions on sharing data, but relative to the rest of the market, they will be in a far better position comparatively. So those are all, I think, important things.
Yeah, I mean, if the rest of the marketplace is effectively out of business, there's significantly more market share available to Facebook and Google.
So does anybody want to, kind of tackle this one? If you don't like or want advertising, and I already know your answer, Justin, are you willing to pay for the content that's being monetized by it? And what does that do to, kind of equality among elite people who can afford to do that and people who can't? And what does it do to their privacy? Is privacy an elite concept?
But do we have to jump? And this is, I asked this as actually an actual question. Like, do we have to jump straight from if you don't like advertising, then you go to the pay model? I mean, aren't there sort of tons of gradations even within advertising where we could curb some of what we would consider to be the excesses?
That's what I thought Justin's answer was going to be.
Yeah, of advertising. I mean, so of course we've been advertising for a long time without micro-targeting, for example, or lots of other. And I take Ken's point that the market has sort of changed in ways that may make it harder. There's a need for a certain kind of marketing, but are we convinced, like to bring up Pam's point, are we convinced that companies are just going to go out of business because they can't reach anyone, because they have to place an ad on a broad, that they might have more inefficient advertising? Or isn't there a way to think of like non-micro-targeting, contextual advertising that could also be effective? So
this is the biggest challenge I have with Justin's approach, because I think he is, I get the concept of data collection, I get the risks, but what I don't think you're fully swallowing is the negative impact of not being able to have that, that innovation, that level of product. I mean, I don't know, like what, it's less about whether this company can advertise at all. It's low cost advertising to build the initial business. And so what companies would have gone under but for their ability to advertise in this way?
Yeah, I think that's a really important argument that we have to hear. I did this report on the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and I looked at wealthy schools and I looked at poorer schools. And I found out that, there is tremendous discrepancy even in schools, and it's horrifying. And I think we do have to look at issues of businesses that would be negatively impacted by this. We have to face this aspect of it too. And let's get some data on all of these points. Why not? That would really help. I think if we're going to make policy around this, we need to have data. It needs to be evidence-based policy making, and let's put our energy into that. And I think if advertisers would open up and allow people to conduct meaningful and neutral research on some of these points, I think would really help move things to a more fact-based and hopefully more productive place.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I'll use my my advocacy position here in Washington to try to encourage research around that, Pam, because I do agree with you that data-driven information is absolutely necessary to solve this. I think here at the NAI, we have a lot of work to do to think about things like the duty of care, to think about Pam's point about banning outright certain harmful uses, although what's harmful is a whole separate hour of debate. But I'm leaving this, and we're gonna have to wrap because it's 3 o'clock, but I am leaving this panel with a sense of optimism that we can get this right. I feel strongly that this industry isn't going away. We are primed for great things, and I think responsibility is paramount, as Justin pointed out, and it starts with us to try to encourage the right environment, and we will continue to do so. So again, thank you all for attending. I feel like we could have gone on for at least another hour, and maybe we will bring this panel back for a repeat performance, because we do have a lot to talk about. And just one more reminder or a plug for October 22nd, where we will get into detail on our guidance on location data and other issues around the use of location data with Byron Tao from the Wall Street Journal on October 22nd. So thanks everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.